Welcome back to the Davos Daily Show. I'm Polita Clark here with Andrew Hill, here in Davos during the World Economic Forum. Today's show shifts to people, how economies invest in skills, productivity and innovation, and how technologies like artificial intelligence are being deployed in the real world.
Good morning. We'll begin with a keynote interview with former UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, advisor to Goldman Sachs, Microsoft and Anthropic, on geopolitics, economic competitiveness and the practical realities of AI adoption, particularly for smaller firms and slower growing economies.
And from there we'll move into Beyond the Magic, making AI and quantum work in the real world, a panel that looks past the hype to the challenges of implementation, trust and governance.
We'll also hear from Miguel Stilwell-Andrade, Chief Executive of EDP, on electrification, grids and the growing energy demands of AI. Later today, Martin Wolf will sit down with Geeta Gopinath, former Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, to discuss the economy, debt and the latest outlook.
And later, we'll tackle one of the fastest moving risks in the digital economy in AI and the new face of fraud, looking at how criminals and institutions are using the same technologies in different ways.
As always, we'll weave in questions to provide insight from across the WF meeting and bring you the conversations people are having behind closed doors as well as on the main stage.
That's what to look out for today. Let's go straight into our first session.
Good morning, everyone.
Welcome back to the Davos Daily Show and a very warm welcome to Rishi Sunak, former UK Prime Minister, now advisor to Microsoft, Goldman Sachs and Anthropic, the AI company. Welcome, Rishi. Thank you for joining us.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So we're live from Davos on a day when Donald Trump is due to arrive, albeit belatedly, having had a technical problem on his flight over. What is the way in which the European allies, I think we can still call them allies, should tackle Donald Trump, particularly on this issue of Greenland, which was not on anybody's bingo card for being the lead geopolitical story of Davos 2026?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is it's obviously incredibly unsettling, and I say that as someone who's a staunch, Atlanticist, and is someone who has always believed in the good that America can do around the world. And so particularly for us Brits, it's a hard thing when one of your closest friends and allies is doing something that you profoundly disagree with. And of course, the Prime Minister's job is to not unduly escalate things, and I think actually hitherto so far he's managed that relationship well. But you just have to be very clear that this is unacceptable, and he's been right to call it out as unacceptable in this instance. And hopefully over the conversations that will happen over the next day or two here at Davos, we can find a way through this. But I think the thing that is puzzling my former colleagues and to me is you've had to get used to an administration president. Often like he has an approach to making deals where he'll start at one place with a view to ending up somewhere else, and so you have to discount a little bit for that, recognize that there's a process, and so people have got comfortable with that, and whether they like it or agree with it or not, they at least understand that process. This, however, feels different because there's recognition in Europe that Arctic security is of course important and needs more focus and resources for all the reasons that have been well documented. And the thing is, Denmark and European allies are prepared to give the United States what they, in theory, need to secure that extra vigilance in the region and commit to providing resources themselves to it as well. So I think what they are finding puzzling is, if this is just a strategy where we start off with an extreme position to end up at something a little bit more palatable, they're happy to do all of those things. The treaty that Denmark originally signed with the US all those decades ago allows for that. Everyone in Europe is happy to see more US activity, more US presence, and support that. So that's the thing that's particularly puzzling to people, is to try and understand what really is the end goal here.
Yes, the short-term tactics, in an odd way, seem more damaging than the end discussion or the substantial discussion.
I mean, look, and if the end point is changing the sovereignty of Greenland, that's obviously unacceptable to European allies. And you think back to, and I go back to the UK-US relationship, because it is so deep and enduring and has been mutually beneficial for both countries for so many decades. You go back to the original Atlantic Charter in 1941, and the principles that underlie that charter, the friendship between our two countries, about countries not seeking aggrandizement, no territorial changes, people being able to self-determine their own futures in their own territories. Those are the founding principles of that charter, which forms a basis for this post-Second World War very close relationship between the UK and the US. If that is the end goal, and this isn't tactics, then that is obviously unacceptable and hugely problematic for the transatlantic alliance. So one can only hope that dialogue over the next day or two can find a way through this that satisfies what are absolutely reasonable concerns about Arctic security, which Europe recognizes and wants to contribute to and involve the Americans in. But even if that happens, the tactics of this, as you say, have damaged people's trust, and that is never a good thing for the long term.
A lot of people I've spoken to already here at Davos who are sort of sympathetic to the Trump regime are saying that Europe just needs to toughen up, start realizing, to use Trumpian terms, that this is a card game. Trump has a lot of cards, perhaps even start playing some cards of its own. It does seem as though Europe is the weaker partner here. What can European allies really do here to show their own mettle, to play some of their own, perhaps, economic cards?
Yeah, it speaks to a broader point, actually, Andrew, is if you think back to, well, certainly when the European Union or Economic Community was created, it was created in the shadow of awful wars on the European continent. And someone actually in the Commission put it to me this way, and I thought it was a good way of putting it. He said, look, this institution that we've created was essentially designed to keep peace within Europe. That was a large part of its DNA and its founding. And so for this entity to now project hard power, to think about itself as needing to compete in a world where hard power matters again, is actually psychologically quite an adjustment.
Yes, it's against nature.
Exactly. It's not, and you see this obviously very vividly. I was in Germany recently. You think about the change in what we are all asking of our German friends and partners when it comes to more defense spending, more German defense spending, Germany playing a leading role in European defense. That's not what historically the ask was of Germany, and for them it's been a change. Again, psychologically, to ask Europe's largest country to take on that role is an adjustment that they are coming to terms with and responding to the challenge very well under Friedrich's leadership. But I think this point that this person made to me is a good one, and of course we can go through various policies that Europe can use, and none of them are particularly palatable to people who believe in free market economics, obviously, when we're talking about trade retaliation. But I think there's a bigger question about just the psychological capability of this continent, this institution, to operate in a hard power world. And I think that is something that we have to actually acknowledge is necessary.
Yes.
The old world order, I'm sure we'll get onto this, that old world order that we operated under is gone.
Yes.
This is the new world order, and the quicker we adjust to it, the better.
In the meantime, while we're distracted by Greenland, a confrontation we never had on the agenda, we tragically have still got Ukraine to handle. What's the strategy for keeping Trump and the US interested in supporting the opposition to Russia in Ukraine and finding some solution there?
Yeah, and I think this is actually illustrative of just what we've been talking about. When you talk about Europe's ability to retaliate or project that hard power with the US, and we had that conversation last year in response to Liberation Day and the conversations that happened, and ultimately, Europe didn't do that. And partly the reason Europe didn't do that was obviously the Ukraine situation and a desire to keep America engaged in that conflict and continue to provide resource and support, which makes a big difference. And this is obviously existential for the continent to ensure that Russia is not victorious in Ukraine. I dealt with that in office. I think where we are now is, if I think about what are the conditions I'd like to see for lasting peace, I think the first is credible and durable security guarantees, which, to the administration's credit, a few weeks ago, they said some very positive things on that front. And of course, the detail of these things need to be worked out, but taken at face value, that's a big step forward, because security guarantees do need to involve the US in some capacity. I think there does need to be some type of physical presence from Western allies in Ukraine. And again, there are different ways to do that, but that to me feels necessary. And again, we've got to a place through the coalition of the willing and beyond where that condition, one can in theory tick off as well. And then the third one is for Ukraine itself to be well armed and its military to be well resourced. Because the spiky porcupine, as some have described it, needs to be. And again, what Europe has done on looking at the frozen Russian assets, which I've worked on in government, both as Chancellor and Prime Minister and beyond more recently, I think is an important component of freeing up the resources to help Ukraine get the kit and capabilities that it needs. So those are the three, I think, conditions that one would need to see on our side of it. Obviously, Putin needs to feel enough pressure to come to the table, and it's not obvious to me that he feels the sufficient pressure yet. So I fear we are in this situation for longer than we'd like to be. Yeah. Making progress on our side, as I said, on those conditions, but ultimately there needs to be more pressure put to bear on him in order to bring him to their table so that dialogue can happen and we can find a lasting resolution to this. Yes,
for now he may even be just sitting back with his popcorn watching what's happening with Greenland and thinking, I'll just see how this plays out. It does play into his hands.
I'm sure he and our other adversaries around the world have always said, or they've always said and known that one of our great strengths is our network of allies, the fact that we work together, have done very well across economic and security and technology issues over so many decades. It's a great source of strength for the West or the Allied Alliance, however you want to describe it. And fragmentation of that, fraying of that, less trust in those relationships is obviously something that our adversaries will be looking at and welcoming.
Yes. You mentioned Liberation Day. Clearly tariffs and tariff volatility overshadows the whole sort of geoeconomic landscape. I think the WEF put out a study which I mentioned here yesterday when we were discussing the economic outlook, saying that there were 3,000 new industrial policies or tariff measures in the last year. I mean, some of those didn't stick, of course. What's the way in which the economies of the world can absorb this tariff volatility? Trade has a way of finding a way, so I dare say there will be new methods of trading freely, but there doesn't seem much of a voice in politics for free trade at the moment, on right or left.
Yeah, I think it's easy to think that this is all a consequence of the current administration, and I think that would be a mistake, because I think these structural forces that were causing many to re-examine their approach to trade have been in place for a while. And I think there may be two C's that, for me, bring that to life. The first one was COVID. And I remember being in government in the UK, obviously during that period. And it wasn't just the UK. Lots of countries, for the first time, really were woken up to the fact that supply chains mattered. They didn't have access to the things that they really needed when it mattered. And I remember in the UK, you'll remember it, there was an odd moment early on when everyone was fixated on a plane that I think was about to take off from Turkey to bring gowns and PPE and gloves and equipment that we were all very dependent on, and tracking the flight. And I think that is, that's kind of a story that brings to life what capitals across Europe and the world were grappling with during that period. So I think, look, before any of this, that made people re-examine the resiliency of supply chains and actually, what was the right way to organize things. And then China is the other one, and there was I think a plausible view when China entered the WTO about what that would mean for China's development more politically and how it would integrate into the global trading system. I think we have to acknowledge that it didn't work out that way. I think it was a reasonable bet to have made at the time, but it clearly didn't work out that way, and China didn't necessarily subscribe to the same set of rules that everyone else was signed up to, and that has had a consequence in lots of countries, and I think people are much more alert to that. So I think these two things were in force well before this new set of geoeconomics has come into place, and so I think we should see this is something that's a little bit more structural. However, I'm an optimist, and I'm someone who believes in trade as being something that can create jobs and opportunity and wealth for countries. One thing we have seen is countries like the UK saying actually that even if some trade barriers are going up in other areas, who are the other partners that we can look to reduce trade barriers? And I started the work on the UK-India free trade deal. Was delighted the new government concluded that. That's a very positive sign. The EU and India are on the cusp of doing something similar.
We had the EU and Mercosur recently.
Just very recently, and I took the UK into CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, again with bipartisan support for that. And again, that's something that I think that the EU will look at as well. You're seeing strengthening trade dialogue amongst the ASEAN nations as well. So, I don't think it's completely bleak. I think there are lots
remaking itself.
Yeah,
a little bit
and it will look different. And one big global trading system, is not going to operate in exactly the same way. That doesn't mean that partners, either in regions or more generally, can't find ways to reduce trade barriers where it makes sense.
Yes.
And I think, as you've just seen in the last few weeks, more talk and deals on that front, and that's to be welcomed.
Yes. What do you have a hypothesis for the lagging performance of the big European economies? You've got Germany, France, and the UK. I know you don't want to backseat drive this government, but I mean, what's the problem here? Because the South Europe is thriving by comparison.
By comparison, and I think Europe. There were three big, almost operating assumptions for a lot of Europe's development over the past couple of decades. One was that you would have cheap energy from Russia. Another was that you could rely on the US for security and defense investment. And the third was that you'd be able to export to China. And if all three of those big underpinning assumptions have now been upended. And again, started before this administration. President Obama first spoke to the Europeans about investing more in defense. So I think that that's quite a structural change for Europe. So we should recognize that. And it takes time for economies to adjust to big structural changes like those. And so that's the first thing. So these are not overnight fixes. Then if I step back a little bit and try and diagnose some of the issues, I think one is that Europe spent the peace dividend from falling defense expenditure on the thing that is hardest to now unwind, which is health and welfare benefits, and welfare in particular. And Angela Merkel's famous line that she used, I'll get the numbers not quite right, but Europe accounts for 7% of the world's population and 20% of the world's GDP, but 50% of the world's welfare spending, and that's not sustainable. All those numbers probably have got worse since she
Yes.
said it. And I think actually in all three countries, France, Germany and the UK, you've seen attempts by political leadership to try and tackle some of those things. And in all cases, it's gone the other way, where welfare spending continues to rise. So I think that is one structural fiscal issue. We are in a fiscally constrained environment. Obviously, Germany's a little bit of an exception. People can see what's happening with Japanese bond yields. We've seen what's happened in the UK in the past. So that limits fiscal space. So that's an issue. And you've got structurally high energy prices, 2 to 4 times higher than the US, at a time where AI is a energy-intensive revolution, so that's another problem. And then we talked about the sources of hard power earlier. Technological strength is a source of hard power, but also economic opportunity, and that is the thing that holds out the promise for growth. And so in Europe, what we really need to do is seize that opportunity. And one of the things that I was keen to do when I was in government is make sure that the UK remains the most innovative economy in Europe, because I think that is our path to drive higher growth. And because of AI and other technologies, we're sitting at a point in time where actually that feels less like a pipe dream and more something that we can make real.
I guess the question is, will it come fast enough for these, as it were, conventional political parties that are in power in the UK, Germany and France to reap the benefit and see off a challenge that seems to be coming from the right in all three countries?
I think it is actually within their control. They have agency in this. I think the great paradox of our time is that this is in one moment the most dangerous period that we've lived in our adult lifetimes. We're in this new world order. It's less rules-based, it's more power-oriented. Pax Americana is gone. The US role in the world is changing. You've got the rise of multipolarity, states like India and the Gulf with their own views. Hybrid activity in Europe was up 4 times last year. Sabotage activity from Russia. You've got more state-based conflict than I think at any point since World War II. Right? This is the new geopolitical environment.
Yeah.
It's very dangerous. And you hear all of that and you think, I want to put my head back under the duvet. But actually, the paradox is this is also the most transformational moment in our lifetimes because of not just AI, but other technologies, whether it's what's happening in biotechnology or energy or quantum. So what I'd say is, look, if you're a leader today, I see how CEOs are focused on AI with urgency, recognizing they have to change their business models and radically embrace this and adopt it. Otherwise, they'll get competed away or disintermediated. I'm not sure if political leaders have grasped the urgency of that moment and what it requires for them to talk to their citizens, but to change how governments work, how public services are delivered. And I know from sitting in the chair, unless the person at the top says, this is my priority, I'm going to have a meeting on it in the cabinet room pretty much every day, until we get all the change we need. It probably won't happen at the pace we need it to your point. But that doesn't mean it can't.
Right.
And I'm a big believer in this concept of technology diffusion and Jeffrey Ding's book, which I know you and FT readers will be familiar with. But his thesis was, if you look at the history of technology revolutions, like electricity or steam, or going back as far back as the printing press in Germany, you don't need to be the country that invents that technology to be the country that gets the most benefit out of it.
Right.
And I think AI can be like that. Of course, the US and China are engaged in a race for frontier innovation AI and race for AGI, and that's fine. And actually for the UK or European countries, we should focus on the race to adopt and deploy this technology in our economies as quickly as humanly possible.
Yes.
And there's no reason why we can't. And of course that you have to think about regulation, you have to think about skills, you have to make sure your citizens trust it, you have to roll it out in the public sector, in healthcare, in welfare, in education, so they see the benefit of it. You need to help your small businesses embrace it so they don't get left behind, because they, at the end of the day, account for most of the employment. So I think all of that is possible, but it requires a level of urgency and focus that we probably haven't seen yet. But as I said, there's no reason why we can't seize that opportunity.
I mean, one of your bosses now, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, where you're an advisor here in Davos yesterday was saying that this was a definition of an AI bubble if only the big tech platforms and the developed world benefit and grow bigger and richer as a result. So that diffusion message is out there. What is the best way to get that to actually happen? I mean, is it, apart from the top-down political impetus, there are a variety of warnings out there now about divisions opening up between rich and poor, global south and north, the kind of risks that AI benefits only English-speaking nations. I was speaking on a panel yesterday with a Qatari minister about the lack of Arabic AI, inclusive AI that brings in the 2 billion who aren't even on the internet yet.
Yeah. No, so look, lots to unpack in that. Let's if we start with the developed world first, and then maybe go on to this the gap between the developed and developing world. So I think that interestingly, in the quote unquote developed world, there's a really interesting public attitude difference about AI. When you compare how people in Europe, the UK, the US think about AI compared to how people in the global south or in countries like India or China think about it. And they're far less trusting of it, and they're far less optimistic about it by a huge margin. Almost, people in those other countries, India, China, are almost twice as likely to be positive about AI, the benefits it will bring, and the fact that they trust it compared to much lower levels of trust and optimism in developed countries. So that's the first place to start with if you're a leader in one of these countries, is you need to change that, because people are not going to adopt a technology that they're not optimistic or they don't trust. And part of that is talking to the country about it. I think we just need more conversation. Leaders need to explain to their citizens how big a deal this is, how it is going to change everything in our lives, in our societies, in our public services, and explain to them how it's going to benefit them. Actually starting with the public sector. Remember, the public sector accounts for 40% of GDP in most of these European countries. And actually just making people's day-to-day interaction with a state that right now they feel in all these countries is not working very well, work better, quicker, faster, more accurately, save money, help cut taxes, help get your appointment quicker. That would be an enormous positive, not just for countries, for people's faith in democracy and government, but also for people to see the benefit of AI and then be able to get the broader diffusion. So, I'd start there on actually public attitudes, and then you get into all the policies around skilling and regulatory environment, et cetera, which we can go into. But I think we broadly know what we need to do, and it's just a question of getting on and doing it. And then there's your other question about the gap opening up. And look, there's obviously a resource gap. I think interestingly, I think there's more data center capacity. I think 7 times more data center capacity in Virginia, the state of Virginia, than there is in the entire continent of Africa.
Yes.
And your point on language is really well made. These are large language models. They're trained predominantly on English language. There's billions and billions of people who don't speak English, or certainly don't speak it as a first language, and the output is very different for them. And India, case in point, where there's multiple languages within India, and now there is more acknowledgement of that and work going on to help rectify that gap. But I'm optimistic, because I think one of the things AI can do is it can dramatically reduce the costs and democratize public goods like healthcare and education. And in lots of these countries, the ability to deliver very high quality healthcare at scale to people in rural areas is something that can be really powerful. Similarly on education, which I'm a great believer is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet in public policy is strong education. Right now there's organizations in India and Africa that are delivering high quality AI tutoring for $2 a month, which is showing progress twice as fast as for the kids that don't have it. And so, I'm optimistic that actually there are some gaps that AI can help us close. But, going back to your point before about Europe and, there's the gap between Europe and the US. In the last decade, those two regions had roughly similar GDP. And in about a decade, the US has leapt about a third ahead of Europe.
Are we placing too much faith in the likes of Satya Nadella or Dario Amodei at Anthropic to stay their hand when it comes to just going for the big profitable outcomes here? I mean, they're well-meaning chief executives, but are they going to do it on their own, diffuse it to the wider world, or is there a risk that they simply
I think,
run off
look,
with the money?
I'm fortunate to spend time with both Dario and Satya and both of those organisations, which are both in their different ways extraordinary organisations. Let's start with Microsoft. When Satya talks about AI, he's focused on making sure that it can benefit people. Ultimately, Heritage is an enterprise software business. He's interested in technologies that can make people more productive in their day-to-day lives. And he himself would say, look, this thing is not going to work unless it shows up in people's wages, in their in their GDP statistics. So I think the relentless focus in that organization is getting this tool into people's hands so that they can live more productive lives and do their jobs more effectively and productively. That is the mantra that they're focused on, which I think is positive and good. At the same time as providing the infrastructure that countries and companies need to get the benefit of this new technology. Now, look, Dario obviously is developing this technology. It's something that he speaks very passionately and articulately about. And if anyone hasn't read his essay, Machines of Loving Grace, I would commend it to you. And he paints what I think is an inclusive and inspiring vision of what AI can do for humanity.
Right.
And not just making us more productive and efficient and creating GDP and economic opportunity, but also the benefits it can bring in healthcare in particular. And it's something he knows about. His background is in biological sciences as well. And he talks about the ability to compress a century's worth of biological discovery into a decade.
Yes.
Even if he's half right, that's extraordinary. And
so you're positive on that.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see it. I think, look, this year, these are the things that make me optimistic, and there's a lot of scary geopolitics, but this year we'll probably see the results of large-scale human trials for personalized mRNA cancer vaccines. We will probably see the first drugs enter human trials that have been developed entirely by AI, much quicker and faster than how we used to do drug discovery. So I think we will start to see this tangibly happen, and certainly that's what he and the people at Anthropic believe their mission is to develop this technology to benefit humanity. And Dario, and I got to know him and Demis and others when I was in office. Certainly, my job when I was in government was to make sure that governments are going to ensure that they do their bit to make sure that technology is handled responsibly and put whatever guardrails are necessary. And that's why I held the AI Safety Summit at Bletchley Park and created the now AI Security Institute to make sure we understand the risks. But I remain an optimist that we can do this, but it does require leadership.
Yes.
Dario and Satya can talk about this all day long. It requires political leaders, business leaders, all of us to get up to speed with what's happening fast and grab it with both hands.
Rishi Sunak, we're out of time. No time to talk about your numeracy campaign, the Richmond Project, but I do recommend people to look out for that. But thank you for joining us on the Davos Daily Show and bringing a bit of optimism and connection to these diverse subjects that we've discussed.
Well, Andrew, thanks so much for having me. It's been a great discussion. And if people are interested, please do go look at the Richmond Project online. It's this charity that my wife and I have started to help everyone in the UK have better confidence with numbers, which we believe will help everyone live a better life. And it's not about everyone becoming a maths PhD, it's about everyday number confidence, something that I know the FT is passionate about with its campaign on better financial literacy education, which I think is a great way to unlock opportunity as well.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.